Hey there, this is Natalie, and this is embarrassing, so I'm only going to say it once, but I want to have your kittens. Nya. Well, that set the tone for this one. Like and subscribe for more quality anime analysis. Okay, but to be serious, this video is going to be all about the relationship between Eris and Rudeus in Mushoku Tensei, as far as we've seen in the anime. There won't be any spoilers about what happens next between them, though if you're looking for more about that, you can check out my video about Rudeus's love life. For this one, I just want to talk about the build-up, the climax, and the heartbreak Rudeus was ultimately shown to experience in episode 22, or for light novel readers, at the end of volume 6. One thing I will be talking about is Eris's perspective before she left Rudeus, which wasn't shown in episode 22 of the anime, but was in the light novel. It is possible this will be something shown in episode 23, the final episode of the season, but I'm not sure about that, given some other things that will need to be included to end the arc, and given Eris's perspective was also apparently left out of this part of the manga adaptation. This means some stuff I'll be talking about may spoil something from episode 23, but also may not. And if it isn't in the anime, then it's going to be some pretty important skipped content. I will actually read out some of Eris's point of view stuff from the light novel later in the video, so you can see what I mean. I think in a way, leaving out Eris's perspective does have the effect of making us see the depression this sends Rudeus into in a more intense and hard-hitting way than we might see it if the whole thing appeared as more of a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding is what it is, and misunderstandings like this are a fairly common trope in romance arcs, but that can be frustrating to watch. Additionally, the focus next is going to be on how this event affects Rudeus because of the way he perceived it, rather than on that misunderstanding being resolved. I can see then why it may have made sense to get the right emotional impact for us to see only Rudeus's feelings here. Though of course the downside of that is that a lot of people will see Eris here as cruel rather than thoughtless, and may come to hate her, seeing the effect her actions had on Rudy as intentional on her part, when actually her intention was something different. But I'll come to what Eris was thinking. First, let's look at how their relationship came to this point. So, as we've seen over the course of the anime so far, Rudeus and Eris have already had a big impact on each other's lives. Before going to tutor Eris, Rudeus's world was a lot smaller. Other than his family of Paul, Zenith, Lilia and his baby sisters, Rudeus had become close to Roxy and Sylphie, and had considered both of them as ideal romantic partners for the future when his body had grown up. But the dynamics with them were very different to what he experienced with Eris. Roxy was a lot more mature and knowledgeable about this world, and helped him overcome his hang-ups about being out in the world after his time as a shut-in. She also taught him a lot about magic and the world, and his feelings towards her were always those of reverence, something that he continues to feel for her no matter how much he grows. Sylphie was his first true friend, and someone he was able to pass on the things he learned from Roxy to, but both of them were people with little or no experience of having someone else to be close to. Sylphie because she was a young child and had been isolated because of her hair colour, and Rudy because he'd been a shut-in since his teens in his past life, and had never formed any relationships after that. Because of this, they became too dependent on each other. Paul noticed this, and decided it was best for both of them to continue growing up separately, so they could become more independent people, and decide for themselves later if they still wanted to be together. Eris, on the other hand, was not someone who Rudeus admired like Roxy, or instantly wanted to protect like Sylphie. For him to find the things he liked about Roxy and Sylphie, and to be liked by them in return, was playing on easy mode, whereas Eris was very different. At first, his reasons to take an interest in her at all were to achieve something as a tutor, and earn the money to pay for himself and Sylphie to go to the Ranoa Magic University. He wanted to get her to listen to him and respond to his lessons, mainly to complete the challenge of it, though he also saw the value that learning would bring to her. She was violent, stubborn, and had been impossible to get through to for a lot of the other people who'd tried to teach her. There were people she did listen to and respect, but they were people who, in a way, enabled her aggressive way of thinking, her grandfather Sauros and Ghislaine. Rudeus managed to find ways to win her respect and get her on his side, and in doing so, he was able to help her learn and mature. She didn't completely change. She is and always will be someone with straightforward thinking who values strength above all else. But thanks to Rudeus, she sees that sometimes she can get a better outcome by listening to other people's plans and working with them. Eris not only has the classic Boreas grey rat fetishism for beast people, she also has their kind of social mentality, where she will happily follow someone else as long as they've proven they're strong. Now she includes things like wisdom and smart thinking in what she recognises as strength in other people, which is why she thinks as highly of Rudeus now as she always did of warriors like Ghislaine and Regerd. A lot of people think of Eris as a tsundere type character, given she does like to beat up the protagonist a lot, and definitely has a character design befitting of a tsundere girl, with her red hair and her mannerisms. But the nature of a tsundere is that she will act hostile or dismissive towards a character she actually wants to get close to, as a way of hiding feelings she's embarrassed by. Eris is not really this. She genuinely didn't like the idea of being tutored by Rudeus, a boy younger than her, in subjects she wasn't interested in. Her aggressiveness towards him was her true feelings. A tsundere is also often fairly normal towards everybody but the love interest, whereas Eris is violent and hostile towards everyone except Ghislaine and Sauros, who she likes. As she started to warm to Rudeus too, she didn't really attempt to hide this either, as a tsundere would. Later, she will always stick up for Rudeus and speak highly of him to anyone who'll listen, but will still act just as violently towards other people, and towards him too, when he does something she doesn't like. She's not a classic tsundere who Rudeus has to get past the tsun side of before getting to see her dere side. Her aggression is not down to insecurity or to being afraid of what might happen if he knew she liked him. She has an immature handle on it because she's young, but other than that, it simply is her personality, and will remain her personality even once Rudeus has become her favourite person in the world. And interestingly, as a genre-savvy character who himself at first saw the people around him as manifestations of tropes he'd seen before, Rudeus sees himself that he can't just think of Eris as a tsundere. He can just understand and predict the feelings of, just by recognising that character archetype from media in his old world. He realises that while real girls he meets may have some of the trappings of the tropes he's encountered in dating sims and stories, there's something more than that. The tutoring of Eris is something quite interesting too, in that the usual tropes you'd expect to see come into play here actually don't. Yes, Rudeus teaches Eris to read and write and do a bit of math, but this knowledge doesn't actually go on to help her or particularly change her worldview. Both Eris and Ghislaine forget most of what Rudy taught them during that period, and never really care about keeping up their studies in anything but fighting. What Rudeus teaching Eris about these things, as well as magic, actually does do, instead of allowing Eris to use these things too later in the story, is make her see Rudeus as incredibly impressive and skillful. His bravery and other positive aspects of his personality appeal to her too, but it's by seeing how good he is at the things that she sees from her own time trying to study them as very difficult and requiring a lot of talent. She begins to think of him as a reliable person who can do anything. This idea is reinforced in her time and again as they travel around after the mass teleportation incident. Rudeus becomes just as amazing in her eyes as Regerd, more so even, but because it happens as the result of many, many occasions where Rudeus did or knew something he either didn't think was that impressive or which he felt he didn't deserve the credit for, he never truly realises how high Eris's opinion of him is. Rudeus can't explain to Eris that some of the things he pulled off were down to taking advice from the man god or Hitagami, because he's not sure what he himself thinks about all of that yet. He also still feels a huge amount of self-doubt from his previous life, and no matter what he's achieved here so far, he can't really accept that he himself deserves credit for doing more than just putting in the work. It's like a very intense form of imposter syndrome, because naturally, in his mind at least, Rudeus is an imposter, someone who the world sees as a genius child, but who's really someone with memories of 34 years of life in another world. He mentally downplays anything he does successfully as being because of one unfair advantage or another, and still really sees himself as scum. In his mind, he hasn't done enough yet to allow himself to feel like he's atoned for wasting his first life. We see how quick he is to attribute successes that are clearly his to Roxy for teaching him, rather than to see himself how other people, and especially Eris, actually see him. And this is really why Rudeus ends up as sad as he is at the end of episode 22, when Eris leaves him with only a note. Eris is not a good communicator, and she knows this, but she also doesn't understand that someone as great as she thinks Rudeus is would immediately blame himself for her leaving, in the absence of any better explanation. It doesn't cross her mind that he would naturally conclude she was rejecting him forever because he wasn't good enough. It doesn't occur to Eris that he'd have hang-ups about his sexual performance, given she thinks he's inexperienced because he's young, just as she is, rather than because he lived another life up to his mid-30s without ever having any romantic or even social relationships. But just as none of this can occur to Eris, equally it can't occur to Rudeus that she left him because she didn't think she was good enough for him. Yet. And that she always meant she'd return when she was stronger. So, to show what I mean about Eris's actual intentions, I'm going to read a bit of Eris's point of view from the light novels. This part comes just after they consummate their relationship, and before Rudeus wakes up. First, she recounts how she saw all of the events from Rudeus coming to tutor her, up to returning to her former home and finding her family was gone, and shows how her feelings for Rudeus developed from her first realising she was in love with him way back on his birthday right before the mass teleportation incident, through to how she feels now, 3 years later. And I won't read that whole part, but it's in volume 6 of the light novels, and I'll link to where you can get them in the description. I'm just going to go over what she says about why she's leaving him now, and why she only leaves a vague note. He was so young, and yet he'd always protected me. He spent the entire voyage healing my seasickness when we were on the ship, and was incredibly exhausted when we disembarked. Compared to that, what was I? I'd gotten more powerful. I'd gotten fairly decent at swordplay, but I got so caught up in my image of Rudeus's magnificence that I ignored how little he really was. In the end, I used my anxiety about losing my family as an excuse to force myself on him, and treated him poorly in the pursuit of my own desire. I'll say it again, I loved Rudeus, but I was not fit to be with him. I would only be a burden to him. We'd become family, but we couldn't become more than that. We couldn't be husband and wife. Even if we were together, I'd just keep holding him down. For now, it would be better if we spent some time apart. This thought occurred to me naturally. As long as I was with him, I would take advantage of his kindness. The sweet sensations of the night we'd spent together still lingered in my body, so much so that I ached for it. This was characteristic of the Grey Rat family, though unexpectedly, Rudeus might not share those proclivities as strongly. He was trying his best to keep up with me, but at this rate, the fierceness of my desire might confuse him. I couldn't do that to him. I had no intentions of doing what Alphonse said and marrying another man. It was too late for him to tell me to live like the daughter of a noble family. Being told to make sacrifices for the region's citizens when I didn't even really know those citizens had no appeal to me. My grandfather, my father, and my mother were all gone. The Fitoa region was all gone. what was the point? I would discard the Boreas name, but I was still the granddaughter of Sauros and the daughter of my parents, and so I would live on with an iron will. I'm going to get stronger, I resolved. I would part with Rudeus and keep training. I wouldn't stop until I could stand side by side with him. I didn't have to be able to defeat him, but at the very least, I wanted to become a woman who was befitting of his stature. One who wouldn't have people whispering behind her back if she got close to him. I didn't have Rudeus's shrewdness, so instead I would seek power. Ghislaine, Regerd and Gisu had said I had talent with the sword, and I would trust their words. I would follow Ghislaine's recommendation and head to the sword sanctum. There I would become a powerful, precise swordswoman. A swordswoman, me, and a magician, Rudeus. The traditional pairing was the other way round, but both of us were fine with that. We would grow, get stronger, and meet each other again. Then we would take the next step in our family and become husband and wife. I would have his kids, and we would live happily ever after. Now then, how should I go about telling him goodbye? Rudeus was an excellent speaker. No matter what I tried to say, he might stop me. He might try to come with me because he was worried about me being alone. Perhaps I should leave a note. But knowing me, I'd probably leave some trace behind when I did so. He could use that to track me down and it would be a mess. He needed to move forward. I didn't want to hold him back. At times like these, it was best to act like the swordsman in all of the stories and quietly leave. But Rudeus was always going on endlessly about reports, communication and discussion. I didn't want him to hate me. Alright, I would leave something short. Then surely Rudeus would understand. This is when the novel switches back to Rudeus's perspective and we see him waking up happy and then finding the note. Eris has a lot of concerns here. She realised while she was sleeping with him that he was younger and smaller than her, and how much he put up with and done to keep her safe in spite of that, thinking that she herself hadn't done enough and couldn't stand by his side. She thinks she's perhaps taken advantage of him here, and too many times in the past too, and the fact he couldn't keep up with her in bed really reminded her of how she was physically stronger, and yet he'd still taken care of her without complaint. She thinks if she stays with him now, she'll keep taking advantage of his willingness to help and protect her too, and as someone with a straightforward way of looking at the world, that seems completely wrong to her. She knows her strengths lie in fighting, so she thinks she has to become a better warrior so she can bring something more to the table, and they can become a true partnership. She also thinks that Rudeus wouldn't allow this to happen if he knew, again because she believes him to be too good for her current self, but also she has faith that he'll understand her intentions from her note. Now, yes, in terms of the story, this does come across as one of those misunderstandings common in romance plots, where everything could be solved if people just had one conversation. But often when that kind of thing happens in stories, the reaction of the one who's left behind seems a bit contrived. While leaping to the worst conclusion may not be a rare reaction from real people, it often feels like a character that is normally proactive about things, just assuming they've been ditched because they suck, and not attempting to find out what really happened, or even doubting their own conclusion about it, is something that's just in the story to add some drama to a relationship where both partners really do actually love each other and want to be together. It's actually an essential part of the expectations people have when reading a romance story, that some form of conflict or breakup happens partway through the story, so the couple has something to overcome. That's literally one of the unbreakable rules for writing commercial romance novels. Mushoku Tensei isn't a romance novel, I'm just explaining why this kind of misunderstanding feels like such a common trope. Because it can be a way to create a struggle and some drama in a love story without the characters actually intentionally hurting or betraying each other, or breaking up because they legitimately don't want to be together, which could, of course, stop the reader from rooting for them as a couple. However, here in Mushoku Tensei, it actually doesn't have that contrived feeling. At least, I don't think it does, in terms of how Rudeus reacts. This is because he's already been so developed as a character that we know a lot about how he thinks of himself, that Eris couldn't possibly know. We know he's not being humble. He really does have a very low opinion of himself, but for reasons nobody in this world has seen. We know Eris definitely wasn't taking advantage of him from his perspective, and we know it would never occur to him to think that she'd think she was. Eris may think the separation won't really matter to him. After all, they're very young and there will be plenty of time for them to be together in the future once she's satisfied that she's strong enough. But we know that Rudeus isn't thinking about the future like she is. He's thinking about the past, as someone who lived his adult life in another world, assuming nobody would ever love him or want to be with him in that way, and who now, after just one night together, feels like all his fears about not being good enough have been confirmed. Eris sees herself as the heroic swordsman, leaving like a ghost to do the right thing, not letting her own needs or emotions get in the way of what she believes she needs to do to be worthy. It's a romantic idea of stoicism and strength that is all in her mind, but she's 15, and her influences are people like Reincarnation and Ghislaine, so it's understandable that she'd see herself as on some kind of warrior's path and want to be proper about it. She dramatically cuts off her hair, renounces her nobility, and leaves to go and endure the toughest training she knows where to find, all the while thinking to the future, where she's a strong fighter that will stand beside Rudeus as a powerful mage, and that all feels right to her. But to Rudeus, well, he's alone now. Reincarnation is gone, Eris is gone, he has no home to return to, and his mother Zenith is still missing, with all the rest of his family far away and trying to find news of her. The only thing he can really do is continue trying to find word of Zenith himself, and other missing people like Sylphie too. And this was always what he'd planned to do next. He'd just never imagined it would be in this lonely, depressed state. And that's really all I can say about the relationship between Rudeus and Eris without going beyond what's covered in season 1 of the anime. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Thank you, as always, to my supporters on Patreon who are on screen now, and thank you too to everyone who helps me out by subscribing to my channel and watching my videos. Thank you for watching this one, and I hope to see you again very soon.